I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. Today we'll talk about how the 5 boroughs came to be one city and the benefits we still experience from what's known as Greater New York's consolidation. But first, a big week in Washington, the historic challenge to choose a Speaker of the House, the first time nobody won on the first ballot since 1923. Another historic date, the second anniversary of the Capitol insurrection. We're joined by Luke Broadwater, a New York Times Congressional Reporter, and he joins us from Washington. Luke, is what's been going on in Washington sort of a nonviolent insurrection in the Capitol? We're talking, of course, on Thursday. We may be overtaken by events over the weekend, but what has been going on politically?
Well, it's hard to overstate how dysfunctional and chaotic things are on Capitol Hill right now. We've had 6 votes in a row for the Speaker, and every time Kevin McCarthy has failed to get those votes. So there's just been a crazy rush of negotiations, closed-door meetings, television hits, making threats or demands or counter-arguments. And it's just a mess right now. Over the course of 2 days, the House has essentially ceased to exist. I mean, they can't process payroll. The members who used to get classified briefings, who are supposed to be informed about what's happening in sensitive situations across the world, have been kicked out of the secure facilities. They don't have their classified briefings anymore. They're no longer actually even members of Congress. They're members-elect. So the place is in a deep state of dysfunction. Maybe things will get worked out, maybe they won't. But as of right now, it's a historic embarrassment, I think, for the country.
Luke, the rest of the country seems to be getting along just fine. I don't think most people notice this going along, at least not yet. But what does it portend, whether Kevin McCarthy is elected or not elected? What does it mean for what a Republican majority in the House can accomplish over the next 2 years?
Well, if this week is any indication, the answer is nothing. If they can't even come together to choose a speaker, how can they come together on any issue? They are so bitterly divided. There's such a large faction of people inside of the conference whose main goal, it seems, is to tear Washington down, to ensure that nothing passes, nothing is accomplished, don't want to make a deal, don't like the state of things in Washington and want to see it ultimately destroyed. That, I don't see how they could ever get anything done as a unit. Now, things could change. Maybe negotiations will bear some fruit. I do believe among the holdouts that there are some who are willing to make a deal if they can get certain rules changed in the Congress. There are others who are just bitterly opposed to Kevin McCarthy personally, and to most of the Republican leadership personally. And so I don't think that's going to change.
What is it the recalcitrant Republicans want, either from Kevin McCarthy or from some alternative? What is it they have been holding out for?
Sure. Well, there's a range of things, and everybody's different. There's 20 of them. Some, it's really actually very personal, and they don't want Kevin McCarthy, period. And there's nothing he can do to get their votes. Others may be willing if rules are changed in the Congress. What they're really opposed to, for the most part, is government spending, period. And they want to have more House Freedom Caucus influence over the budget, cutting government substantially. They want the way Congress operates to change substantially, where certain House Freedom Caucus members could call to remove the Speaker at any time, or debate spending bills on the floor into infinity. So and some of the reforms are not actually bad reforms they want. I mean, in some ways, they do want Congress to be a more open, free-flowing place where there's lots of debate on the floor. These huge spending packages don't come in at the last minute where no one's read them. So some of them are not unreasonable asks, but they're using extremely hardball tactics to try to get these what they see as reforms accomplished.
Is it possible, if I'm being Pollyannish, to say there actually might be a possibility of more bipartisanship over the next 2 years because the Republican leadership will need more Democratic votes given these rebel Republicans?
I mean, that would be a nice way to look at it. The problem is that there's huge payback among the Republican base if you work with Democrats. I mean, people get inundated with angry phone calls from the voters, death threats in some cases. If you are seen as one of the Republicans who works across the aisle these days, you get a lot of hate as soon as Donald Trump or the host on Fox News turn on you. And so very few people are willing to do that anymore. Now, could we reach some sort of situation where the Democrats do have to bail out the Republicans? Yes. Like, let's say there's a huge crisis. Congress needs to respond. They need to see the speaker. Would some Democrats be willing to vote present to let Kevin McCarthy win? I don't know, but I think that there's probably a little more give on that side of the aisle. There's been talk that maybe there could be some sort of coalition speaker, a moderate who is supported by both Democrats and Republicans in the moderate wings of those parties. I think that's extremely unlikely. But I guess as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said, in chaos, anything is possible. And right now we have chaos.
And what are the consequences of this in the short term, or are there really any for the general public?
Well, the short term is, let's say you're a Republican voter and you wanted to see robust oversight of the Biden administration. That's not happening right now. They can't issue any subpoenas. They can't haul in witnesses. They can't do any of the oversight they promised all their voters who put them into office in the House. If this dragged on inevitably, we could get to a situation where when it came time to pass the budget or raise the debt ceiling, or do any of the sort of must-pass bills, the National Defense Authorization Act, that could only pass the Senate because the House would essentially not be in existence. So any important bill that would need to pass both chambers right now cannot pass. So if they don't get this resolved soon enough, and if it goes to the 13th, no staff will be paid for the entire month. So we have, a few more days to try to work it out. But then we're talking about impact where essentially the House is shut down. There's not even employees anymore. People aren't. So, the longer it drags on, the more dysfunctional government in Washington becomes.
And the more obvious, I guess, it becomes to everybody else. Where is the investigation that took place by the Congressional Committee going? Recommendations for prosecution. Is there any obligation by the Justice Department, other agencies, to follow those recommendations up?
The short answer is no. The Justice Department does not have to listen to the January 6th committee in any way. And in fact, they may even resent being told what to do by Congress. That said, the January 6th committee did make 4 criminal referrals about Donald Trump to the Justice Department, laying out 4 specific codes that they believe he violated, federal codes. And they laid out their evidence to support that. And they did do an 18-month-long investigation. They interviewed more than 1,000 witnesses. They obtained more than 1 million documents. So they have a lot of evidence to support what they're saying. That said, it's really up to the Justice Department to decide what to do here. Congress can bang, the drums. I still expect the members of the January 6th committee who are still members of the House to continue to try to pressure Merrick Garland to charge Donald Trump. But Merrick Garland has a couple of considerations. One, he has a higher evidentiary threshold to meet. He has to go with beyond a reasonable doubt. He has a law enforcement perspective, not a legislative perspective to consider. And the second is he has to consider the political ramifications for the country. We've never had a administration charge the past president, especially the political rival of that president. And so it would be a precedent-breaking step for the Justice Department to take. That's not to say either way whether it's warranted or not. That's the decision for prosecutors. But you would have to consider the political ramifications for the country in doing so.
Is there anything more that Congress itself can do, taking into account, of course, that now we have a political split in Congress?
Well, what's going to happen in the House is just the opposite, where the House is now going to investigate the investigators. With the Republicans in charge, they're going to take the documents that the January 6th committee has made public, some of which have been turned over to the National Archives. They're asking for those documents to be given to them from the archives, and then they're going to try to turn the tables on the investigators and undermine their findings about Donald Trump and about other Republicans. Now, there is a chance on the Senate side. Some are calling for the Senate to take up the January 6th investigation and tie up any loose ends or do any additional interviews. I haven't heard a ton of buy-in from the Senate for that right now. The January 6th investigation was quite comprehensive, and where they failed to get information, for the most part, that was because of roadblocks, certain witnesses who refused to testify or pled the Fifth Amendment or did not honor a congressional subpoena. And I'm not sure how the Senate could force those same people to turn over documents or testify when they have essentially no more power than the House does to do that. So the Senate could do additional investigation if they wanted to, but I would think that is probably not all that likely.
The January 6th committee was bipartisan on paper. Do you think, having looked at all the hearings, looked at all the testimony, looked at the report, that it in fact was bipartisan in essence in its conclusions?
Well, I think there's a couple ways to answer that. One, the staff of the January 6th committee, for the most part, were seasoned prosecutors. These were people who had run federal prosecutors' offices, both as Republicans and Democrats. They very much saw their investigation as a just the facts, ma'am investigation, and they tried to really bring out impartial evidence and unbiased findings. That said, they were still working for Congress, and Congress is inherently a political body. There were 7 Democrats on the committee, and the 2 Republicans had long since fallen out of favor with the Republican Party leadership. So there was no one on the committee who was running interference, so to speak, and blocking the investigation or inserting pro-Trump talking points, anything like that. So from that angle, it did have a certain perspective. That said, the facts are the facts. Like, they uncovered lots of evidence that I don't know how you argue with. And most of their evidence came from Republican witnesses. Secretaries of state who were Republican, local elections officials who were Republican, people with inside the Trump White House who are Republican, people with inside the Trump Justice Department who are Republican. These were their witnesses. So I don't know how, as a Republican, you assail some of the things these fellow Republicans were saying about what Donald Trump did around January 6th.
Luke, a quick last question. George Santos, the congressman from Long Island, Richie Torres, the congressman, said he'd like to pass a law saying it would be illegal for a candidate to lie about his biography. Can you really pass a law like that?
I don't know. I would think that would probably violate the First Amendment in some way, but and I haven't heard a ton of appetite on Congress for doing that. Santos is a unique case because the lies are so pervasive. But if you went through Congress and charged every person who lied, we'd clear out the whole chamber. So so many politicians overstate their accomplishments or shade their biographies some. I do think Santos is somewhat unique because of, he seemed to make things up out of whole cloth, and it was in so many different aspects of his biography. It wasn't just, I got this 1 degree, which I didn't really get or whatever. So, or I wrote this speech, which I didn't really write. We see examples like that on the Hill, but I haven't heard a lot of appetite for that. What I think is most likely, if there is some justice to come for Santos, it will probably come more from law enforcement than from Congress. There are several active law enforcement investigations, and if he did end up lying on any financial documents or any official forms, that could cause him more trouble, I think, than lying to the voters.
Luke Broadwater, New York Times from Washington, thank you so much for joining us. And coming up next, the 125th anniversary of Greater New York and what it means for today. Welcome back. It was 125 years ago that New York City went from several different and competing neighbors to a metropolitan family of boroughs administered by one municipality. Joining us, Michael Miscione, the former Manhattan Borough Historian, and he tells us about what that anniversary is all about and what it means for today. Andrew Green, a unsung hero of New York, proposed this in 1857. Mike, why did it take 40 years for it to happen?
It was 1868.
Okay.
But he started his career in
1857.
And that career was basically as the head of the organization that would design and build Central Park. That organization, the Central Park Commission, got more and more authority because the state realized how well Andrew Green and his commission were doing. And eventually they were authorized to plan northern Manhattan above 155th Street, which had not been planned with the famous Commissioner's Street Grid, right? And also to recommend improvements and planning recommendations across the Harlem River, which was lower Westchester County at the time, was not part of New York City. So Andrew Green dug into that problem, and he found that the towns and villages in Westchester County were doing a terrible job of planning their property. There were competing groups. No one was talking to each other. He tried to plan bridges across the Harlem River with New York. They couldn't agree who would pay for them. And finally, in 1868, he's writing a report, and you can almost hear the frustration as he throws up his hands and says, in order for us to rationally, economically, efficiently plan not just lower Westchester County, but the entire metropolitan region. And he mentions the places that would be the Bronx, Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, and of course Manhattan. In order to plan that efficiently, we need to put it all under one government. Basically, he was foreseeing the consolidation that would become reality 3 decades later.
Who was against it?
Mostly the opposition came from Brooklyn, which was an independent city at the time of consolidation. There were 3 independent cities at the time. Of course, New York City, which was Manhattan and what is today the Bronx. There was Long Island City, right? And there was Brooklyn. Now,
which the city of Brooklyn was just that small piece?
No. So the city of Brooklyn at the time was basically the borough.
The whole borough.
It began as a town in Kings County of 6 towns. And over the, talk about the hypocrisy of the Brooklynites, they were doing their own consolidating over the century, gobbling up the other towns until eventually in the 1890s, all of today's Brooklyn borough was the city.
It became contiguous with Kings County.
Exactly. So Brooklyn and Manhattan at the time had 90% of the population of today's 5 boroughs. And so a lot of people wonder, well, why don't you talk about the Bronx or Queens or Staten Island? Altogether, they had 10% of the population. So this really was kind of a titanic battle for pro and anti-consolidation between 2 cities.
And why was Brooklyn opposed?
Well,
they thought they'd be subsumed?
They did. A portion of them. There was a strong contingent, approximately half, who favored consolidation. They thought this would be a great thing for everybody. High tide raises all boats, right? But there are others who identified themselves as kind of the old school, I call them the Brooklyn gentry. Now, this is something we don't think about when we think about Brooklyn today, but there was a Brooklyn gentry. And these folks, these old school, old line Brooklynites, they saw their future not across the East River looking west. They saw their future looking east to Long Island and Yankee New England, because that's where their roots were. And so they resisted this pull across the East River to join New York City.
Michael, there was a referendum that wasn't really supposed to be a binding referendum.
Correct.
But it turned out to be, in effect. They transformed it into one. And Brooklynites called it the great mistake. At least some of them did. Was it a great mistake from their point of view?
I don't think so. If you do the numbers, it was greatly to Brooklyn's advantage. Taken on the whole, I mean, certainly, their identity was subsumed by the identity of being a New Yorker, right? But in terms of the benefits, they were outstanding. And We're talking about things like the money that they would be able to share with New York, because they were at the verge of bankruptcy at the point of consolidation. They couldn't pave their streets, couldn't run sewer lines, and they had a terrible, terrible water supply, which they got their water from. They got their water from Long Island, basically.
And wells.
They had driven wells. They had a few leaky reservoirs. And eventually, Suffolk County and part of Queens County, they were in arms saying, no, you can't keep doing this because that's our water you're stealing, right? And there were other benefits, of course. I mean, there's total benefits in administering the entire metropolitan area under one government, the efficiencies, the economies of scale.
That vote for consolidation was pretty close. Was it a rigged vote?
To my knowledge, no.
Okay.
Maybe you know something I don't know. If you're talking about the referendum vote, yeah, in Brooklyn, it was razor thin. 129,000 total votes cast. Consolidation passed by 277 votes.
So what do you think, given Brooklyn politics?
How so?
Well, I mean,
I'm a Brooklyn boy, don't forget.
So am I, and that's why I'm asking. That's pretty close to raise some skepticism.
Yeah. I don't know. There were charges of other problems, not so much hanky-panky, okay? The anti-consolidationist Brooklynites said that, the people didn't know what they were voting for because there was constitutional amendments that were on the ballot as well. And so they basically wanted a do-over.
That's a Brooklyn kind of term,
exactly.
Right?
And so they wanted to have another binding referendum.
Was there a lack of vision in not including parts of Long Island, more of Westchester, maybe even parts of New Jersey?
If you were to ask Ken Jackson, he would say yes.
The Columbia professor.
Exactly, editor of the Encyclopedia of New York City. In his opinion, we should have grabbed all of Long Island, should have made right up to Westchester County. But there's basically, if you use, let's just say, City Hall as the center of the city, what you find is Manhattanites generally in favor of consolidation because it'll expand the city, it'll make it more of an imperial city, and many Brooklynites in the parts of Brooklyn nearest Manhattan in favor, split, right? And as you go further out, you get a lot of people in favor, although there weren't a lot of people, because as you went out, the population density diminished. Because they wanted to share those benefits they would get with New York's money. But then you get to a point where you're dealing with farmers who don't deal with New York City.
Right.
They don't want to be part of it.
Right.
And so I think the boundaries were just about right.
Turned out. Yeah. And thanks to Michael Miscione, the former Manhattan historian, for making Andrew Green less of an unsung hero. And coming up next, my thoughts on another anniversary, the city's 400th birthday. Sam Cooke's What a Wonderful World was an unabashed hymn to love over learning. It began, "Don't know much about history." Had he written the lyrics for New Yorkers, the song might have begun, "Don't care much about history." We're so concerned about the present and the future that we've let our history be hijacked by places like Boston and Philadelphia and Washington. One sure sign of apathy about the past is how we plan to commemorate another anniversary, the city's 400th birthday. We don't. Arguably, the quadricentennial of European settlement begins next year, but only few plans exist to reevaluate New York's history's highs and lows in the run-up to the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in 2026. That's wrong for two reasons. New York, New Amsterdam at the time, was different from every other colony in what became the United States. Other settlers came to escape religious persecution or to proselytize. The Dutch flocked to their company town to make money. If you didn't get in their way, you were generally unhindered. Idealists labeled it tolerance. Cynics called it indifference. Whatever, it defined New York to the rest of America, and America to the rest of the world. We also forget that New York was the nation's first capital, where Washington was inaugurated as the first president, where the first Congress convened, where it passed what became known as the Bill of Rights, all of which means New York's birthday is worth commemorating. Next year is the 400th anniversary of the founding of New Netherland. New York City's seal and flag would have us celebrate in 2025. 2026 would be 400 years since the so-called purchase of Manhattan. If you're in no hurry, 2053 would be the quadricentennial of when New Amsterdam became a municipality. And a lot has happened since then. Sam Cooke was right about love, but George Orwell was correct about history. Who controls the past, he said, controls the future. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.